photographs in this film were taken in the remote southern Andes of Peru more than 50 years ago and form part of the first comprehensive photographic record that was ever made of the Indian world and the heirs of the Incas. 450 years after the Spanish conquest of Peru, the Indians still tenaciously maintain their most ancient traditions. At the ice festival of Collariti, the Indians trek to the highest source of water in a pilgrimage whose origins go back thousands of years. They ritually carry blocks of ice back to their faraway villages in an act of penance and homage to the mountains and the sun. Martín Chambi was uniquely placed to document the ways of the people of the Andes, since he was an Indian himself. His photographs were a political as well as an artistic statement, and despite his humble origins, he became a prominent member of a group of intellectuals known as the Indigenous movement, who brought the dominant European classes of Peru face to face with a culture they had long ignored. During the making of this film, many new photographs were reprinted from the original negatives and are now being shown again for the first time since they were taken. The archive of Chambi's work, which is kept in the city of Cusco, is now looked after by his daughter Julia, who is also a photographer.
Eso nos decía, siempre decían. Hijos, yo no dejo plata, pero les dejo una mina en todo este archivo. Ustedes tienen que saberla cuidar, cuidarla mucho, mucho, mucho y elevarla un poco más de lo que yo la he elevado.
Chambi died in 1973 and left behind some 20,000 glass plate negatives dating from the early years of the century, the work of a lifetime as a professional photographer. The recent discovery and research of this enormous archive have led to a series of major exhibitions, beginning at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which have introduced his work to the rest of the world. His extraordinary use of natural light and his unique view of the whole of Peruvian society, of the heirs of the conquerors, as well as the heirs of the Incas, have established Chambi's reputation as perhaps the most important pioneer of Latin American photography.
Chambi, lógicamente, era un hombre muy cariñoso, un señor en todas sus actividades, era muy retraído a su arte, era un hombre profundamente dado a la fotografía. Con los medios que había ese entonces, ¿no? Sus máquinas eran las más primitivas todavía. La iluminación de fotografías era preciosa. Había verdaderas obras de arte, ya representaban una especie de pinturas sobre fotografía. Y cariño profundo por el indio, sobre todo. Era un cariño especial a su raza y, por supuesto, no al movimiento indigenista que nosotros representábamos en el Cusco.
Chambi's work was as interesting in the 20s as today because it's the main testimony, a remarkable testimony of a life, of a series of customs, of interrelation between people and the ecological environment, which is the very basis of our national identity. We have been a country which has been watching towards the Pacific Ocean and towards Europe for a long time, since 1532 when the conquerors came. And Chambi has helped us to see our country, to see ourselves, to have the possibility to stop to be a foreigners in our own country.
It was into the closed Indian world of the Andes that Martín Chambi was born in the village of Coasa in 1891. He came from a traditional peasant campesino family who worked and lived from the land.
Él contaba de que muy niño él en su pueblo, en Coasa, estando en escuela, llegó una compañía inglesa ahí a Coasa a lavar oro. El chico curioso de colegio se iba ahí a mirar qué cosas hacían los gringos ahí. Y vio pues, ¿no?, que había un señor con un trípode que cargaba y le llamó mucho la atención la fotografía porque incluso en esa fecha él nos contaba, decía, ¿no?, a mí uno de esos señores me tomó una foto y me la enseñó al rato. Y mi padre se la guardaba la fotografía. Y bueno, yo siempre pensaba en la fotografía. Siempre nunca me olvidé de esa foto y de la idea de ver cómo sacaban fotos. Tomaban fotos, veía yo mi pueblo en las fotografías que tomaba el señor este.
Fascinated by the idea of photography, Chambi left his small village for the nearby city of Arequipa at the age of 14 and found work as an apprentice in a photographic studio frequented by the Europeanized upper classes. This was the first of his many self-portraits. He willingly exchanged his simple rural existence for the modern profession of photographer. In 1919, at the age of 29, Chambi decided to broaden his horizons. With his young family, he traveled to the city of Cusco, the ancient capital of the Inca Empire, which stands almost 12,000 feet above sea level. He was to live and work there for the rest of his life. The striking Spanish architecture of Cusco rests on Inca foundations. The conquistadors destroyed the palaces that stood around the main square and forced the Indians to turn the old stones into Catholic churches. But at the festival of Corpus Christi, the saints are paraded in exactly the same way that the Incas used to parade the mummified bodies of their dead rulers. Effigies are made from the gold and silver which was looted from Inca shrines in the name of Christ. And it is this mixture of the Catholic and the Andean, of the native underneath the Spanish, that is the key to Chambi's work. Cusco has long ceased to be the capital of an empire, but its unique traditions have flourished because of its isolated position in the mountains. Chambi arrived at a time when the city was being opened up to the ideas and inventions of the 20th century, and he enthusiastically documented the new technology of which he, as a photographer, was himself a product. Through his commercial photography, Chambi made his name in Cusco, and every member of his large family was drawn into the business, which they still run today. By the mid-1920s, he had the best studio in the city.
Mi papá era en su trabajo muy organizado, muy cumplido y era muy responsable. Y también quería que nosotros seamos así puntuales, responsables sobre todo, ¿no? No permitía, digamos, que tengamos otros que hacer, sino en el trabajo siempre. Y siempre una cosa que recuerdo de él es que decía, primero es la obligación que la devoción. Mi trabajo fue en el laboratorio, revelar rollos, hacer postales, ¿no? Que durante esos años que trabajé con él hacíamos postales por miles.
Porque claro, el negocio no era demasiado extenso, no era muy grande. Como decía mi hermana, era la venta de películas, los trabajos que llevaban, por decirlo, los turistas, los retratos que se hacían, todo. Él preparó, digamos así, su galería. En la casa que ocupaba, él hizo una galería especializada para tomar sobre todo los retratos, que en una época se dedicó ampliamente a eso.
The majority of the photographs were taken on large glass plate cameras using only natural light. Chambi developed the technique to an extraordinary degree of sophistication, controlling the light by means of thick adjustable curtains and retouching detail in the negative. One of Chambi's assistants in the early 1930s was Cesar Mesa, who now runs his own studio in Cusco.
Esta cámara, muy simple, la utilizaba para tomar fotografías de carnet. Les debo confesar esto. En ese tiempo, el señor Chambi, el señor González, que eran los mejores estudios que había en el Cusco, cobraban por la media docena de fotografías tamaño carnet $1.50. Yo, desconocido, muchacho, y todavía desde luego no inexperto, principiante, ¿cómo podía competir con ellos? ¿De qué manera? Me dije, pues haciendo más barato. Bueno, no tenía ingresos, tenía que buscar trabajo. Entonces así donde acudo a casa del señor Chambi ofreciéndole mis trabajos. Él me dice, bueno, como no, usted quiere trabajar conmigo, encantado, veremos, a ver, usted sabe, veremos.
Chambi moved among a group of middle-class artists and intellectuals known as the Indigenistas, who used to meet in the bars, restaurants, and open-air chicherias of Cusco. The Indigenistas were united by a conviction that the true spirit of Peru lay with the indigenous Indian population, and as such, they were part of a movement common to many Latin American countries at the beginning of the century.
Chambi era un hombre cuya personalidad estaba formada por dos grandes dotes, la sencillez y la sinceridad. Por eso era Chambi un artista muy querido por los intelectuales del Cusco, por estas sus virtudes.
It was basically an intellectual movement, which tried to combat all that old colonial versions that the Indians were a sort of second-class ethnic group. They painted the Indians, they took pictures like Chambi, they wrote stories, novels. It was a massive production which showed the first group of collective interest for this population, which conformed the majority of the country, but which was considered, you know, as I told, a second-class ethnic group in the country.
Desde el año de 1926 comenzaron a visitar los artistas de las diferentes latitudes de Sudamérica al Cusco. Y estos pintores, músicos, etc., eran mensajes vivos del nuevo pensamiento americano y venían hacia el Cusco, se juntaba con la juventud estudiosa en unas fiestas espirituales inolvidables. En esos momentos sale en 1930, si la memoria no me traiciona, la obra El Nuevo Indio de Uriel García.
Uriel Garcia, with his book The New Indian, became one of the central figures around which this generation of Cusco intellectuals gathered. Garcia was a professor at the university and a sympathizer with the newly formed Peruvian Communist Party. He and his group transmitted their ideas through meetings, pamphlets, and above all their newspapers and periodicals, such as El Sol, for which Chambi took numerous photographs. The Indigenistas' activities tended to be artistic and literary rather than directly political, and their support for the Indian was fundamentally theoretical. They came mostly from the professional classes, and Chambi, as a true Indian, was unique among them.
Era un indio, un señor indio. Este es el calificativo que le dio. Era indio legítimo, pero era un señor indio. Porque los indios, ¿no?, han tenido un sentido moral único siempre. Somos los mestizos y los blancos los que les han malogrado el sentido moral de los indios.
The marriage of the European and the native has produced the mestizos, a local term for those of mixed race. Although somewhat westernized, the mestizos have retained the Quechua language and remain close to Indian values. For example, they still eat traditional foods like the guinea pig. Chambi was at home in their world, and through his photographs, he informed the Indigenista intellectuals of the true nature of the culture they were trying to promote. The mestizo world of Cusco was believed by the Indigenistas to be most alive in the open-air taverns known as chicherias. Here, the Indigenistas could meet Indians, get drunk with them, and cultivate their idea of Indianness. Consequently, the chicheria came to take on an almost mystical significance, so much so that Uriel Garcia rather romantically described it as the very heart of the Peruvian culture. By this time, Chambi's work had gone beyond the confines of his studio and postcard business. He was pioneering a documentary style, combining the aesthetic he had developed through his commercial work with the day-to-day life on his own doorstep. In this way, He resembled the Indian artists of previous ages, like the painters of the 18th century who were trained to decorate Cusco's churches. The cathedral has a native version of the Last Supper, but instead of the lamb and the bread, the apostles are about to eat a guinea pig. As well as trying to learn more about the lives of contemporary Indians, the Indigenistas tried to bring about a renaissance of the glories of the Inca past. Chambi began to document all the Inca remains in Cusco, which were too massive and well constructed for the Spanish to dismantle. He also photographed Indians from the countryside who had found their way to the city, building up a comprehensive record of the Indian types, as he called them, living in the Cusco region.
Nosotros, compatriotas del Cusco, tenemos la dicha y la felicidad de ser una sociedad con estirpe, de ser una sociedad cuyos orígenes se pierden en la leyenda más fértil que pudo dar América. América se sintetiza en el Cusco, no solo de la esperanza, sino de la acción de todos nosotros. Cuando andamos por las calles del Cusco, cuando recordamos nuestros viejos ancestros, nosotros, compatriotas del Cusco, tenemos un pasado glorioso que hay que fortalecer, no reivindicar. Pero no olvidemos que Belgrano y que Mitre reclamaron para el Cusco la capitalidad de esta parte que no tiene fronteras, que es la América Morena. Causachum Cusco. Salud por ustedes.
Despite the indigenista sentiments of today's Marxist mayor, Cusco still has a very westernized upper class, and inevitably, now as then, power is in their hands. As a photographer, Chambi regularly covered the parties and gatherings of Cusco society, and his scrutiny of their life offers a sharp contrast to his pictures of the humble chicharias. It was this freedom of movement on both sides of the social divide that enabled him to build such a comprehensive portrait of Cusco life. There was tremendous wealth for the small hacendado class of European settlers who owned land or were involved in financing the growing textile industry around Cusco. They often commissioned Chambi to take portraits of them in their fine homes, but he made a point of including in these photographs the Indians upon whom the bourgeoisie depended for their comfortable existence.
En ese entonces el indio todavía en su mayoría era siervo. De manera que entonces había dos clases o tres clases de servidumbre. Una servidumbre cariñosa en que el patrón era una especie de padre de familia, que regalaba, entregaba terrenos, ayudaba a los indios, ¿no? Era un sentido paternalista. Pero había el latifundio, la vergüenza más grande de la injusticia social en la que el indio era considerado como esclavo. Todavía en las calles, en las casas de mi ciudad, del Cusco, no había el pongo como el símbolo de la servidumbre y de la esclavitud. El hombre que debía esperar al patrón durante toda la noche, echado en un cuero de carnero detrás de la puerta, para abrirle la puerta al señor que venía de sus compromisos sociales. Todavía se pagaban miserias, y se pagaba en alcohol, y se pagaba en coca. La situación era muy triste. Recién se está liberando el indio totalmente. De manera que esa liberación se debe al movimiento indigenista.
The Indigenistas knew that the root of the so-called Indian problem in the Andes was the feudal hacienda system, which was the main vestige of Spanish administration in the countryside. Today, the grand haciendas have, for the most part, been turned into workers' cooperatives. But in Chambi's time, they were the property of the landed gentry, who would employ him to photograph both themselves and the workers that they virtually owned. These photographs had a resonance which Chambi's clients perhaps had not bargained for, and were instrumental in initiating an awareness which led to land reforms some 30 years later.
que al cual me sigo y nadie antes que porque me está haciendo catica que quiere que me han hacer en WhatsApp lo que
Of course, the poverty of the Indians was obvious to the Indigenistas. But because most of them came from the hacienda class themselves, it was hard for them to develop a realistic understanding of Indian life.
It's very important to see that for the Indigenistas it was very difficult to develop a closer relationship with the concrete Indian. So they develop a relationship with the romantic Indian, which includes the certainty that these Indians were devaluated heirs of an ancient glorious time. So it was important for them to say, hey, these guys that we are exploiting now were not always like this. They are the heirs of this extraordinary time when the Incas ran this area, this country, and when the Indians were in command of life in the Andes.
For over 400 years, Machu Picchu, a lost city of the Incas, was completely covered by jungle. Rediscovered in 1911, it became for the Indigenous the great romantic symbol of the lost culture which they were trying to recapture. It was a place of pilgrimage for them, particularly for Chambi.
El indigenismo en esencia ha sido esto: volver a las fuentes, a las raíces profundas de nuestra realidad social política, exaltar el pasado nuestro. El indigenismo ha enseñado al Perú que en el Perú no apareció con la conquista española, que la cultura peruana tiene 25.000 años de antigüedad. Es una cultura tan antigua como las culturas de Occidente. Que el Perú ha sido un mundo cultural diferente al mundo occidental, nada más. Pero más admirable porque la cultura peruana del antiguo Perú abolió el hambre y la miseria. ¿Por qué? Porque no tuvieron moneda, no tuvieron un sentido de riqueza, no tuvieron propiedad privada. La religión era el trabajo, pero el trabajo colectivo en bien de todos. Solamente en el mundo se volverá a ese paraíso incaico cuando desapareciera la moneda, la propiedad privada y la riqueza. El indigenismo ha vuelto a resucitar este pensamiento fraternal.
It was this romantic notion of a golden past which caught Chambi's imagination. He made many expeditions to Machu Picchu, and partly through his photographs, the ruins became known to the world.
Martín Chambi fue el mejor embajador que hizo conocer las maravillas del Perú. Chambi era un hombre que viajaba a los nevados, viajaba por las quebradas, viajaba por las selvas, a veces sin vituallas suficientes. Como la naturaleza es un organismo viviente, varía con la dirección de la luz solar. Y hay un instante preciso en que la naturaleza revela todo su hechizo, y era ese el momento en que Chambi captaba los paisajes. Por eso es que los paisajes que fotografía Chambi son todo un hechizo.
The rediscovery of Machu Picchu prompted popular interest in the forgotten world of the Incas. Music, operas and plays were written and performed on Inca themes and legends, like the epic El Ollantay, the story of an Inca prince who resisted the Spanish yoke. Costumes were researched to the last detail, and the performers were a mixture of Indians, mestizos, and Indigenous sympathizers. But in this climate of revival, Chambi characteristically went even further. To find the true Indian of his own times, he felt he had to go beyond the symbolic stones of Machu Picchu. He traveled all over southern Peru, sometimes for months on end, to places where the purest Indian culture was still alive.
Se ha dedicado a eso, a dar, a buscar, a indagar, a encontrar cosas, rincones bonitos, fiestas. A él le gustaba el folclore mucho.
Cuando salía así al campo a tomar sus fotos en diferentes fiestas, siempre iba en algún día de fiesta del pueblo. Entonces él iba, como dije, ¿no? Él tenía un espíritu especial y era una persona muy, muy agradable, digamos, ¿no? Porque se hacía amigo de toda la gente. Entonces, primero hacía amistad, porque esa gente era difícil de tomar las fotos. Pero él trataba de entrar, ¿no?, al ambiente y justo lo conseguía. Entonces así es como él, primero la amistad y después ya los convencía, les invitaba a tomarles fotos. A veces se ocultaban, no querían, pero de todos modos siempre lograba tomarles. Les llevaba las fotos y les decía, mira, tú te has ocultado y te has tapado, no has querido salir. Y los otros que salían bien estaban contentos. En otra fiesta ya todos estaban listos para hacerse tomar fotos. Todos querían que el señor Chambi les tome las fotos, porque sabían que les iba a llevar y los iba a regalar fotos. Es así como entraba en todas esas fiestas.
In the high Andes, the sheer inaccessibility of the landscape has allowed the most ancient traditions and customs to continue. The annual pilgrimage to Collioriti, which Chambi visited 50 years ago, is still one of the great Andean festivals, and whole villages travel from all over the mountains to take part. Collioriti has been a site of worship since pre-Christian times, and rituals which have their origin in sun worship have now been taken over by Catholicism. The Archbishop of Cusco addresses the pilgrims in the Quechua language.
Anchainayam, Hankunabas, Kaitaitacha Hoyotich, Raurari Ninta, Son Hoikichis Pichaskispa, Chay Raurari Son Juan, Rikitapas, Unuman Tikraika Chinkichis, Ritipas, Chunuyangmi, Son Hoikichis, Raurari Sakai.
The paraphernalia of the modern world are happily absorbed into traditions which are still very much alive. The event is an affirmation of ancient spiritual values and an implicit critique of the European values that were imposed upon them. Some of the dances and masks are a satirical comment on the haughty demeanour and pale bearded faces of the Indians' colonial masters. Today, in spite of the apparently picturesque way of life and the colourful scenery, there is a crisis in the countryside. 1 in 5 children will die in infancy, and life expectancy in the Peruvian Andes is still only 38 years. The life which Chambi documented is fast disappearing as the national economy of Peru has increasingly moved away from the agriculture, which was its very basis. In common with other third world countries, the result has been an exit from the countryside to provincial cities like Cusco or the capital, Lima, in search of work. The cities are becoming hopelessly overcrowded and unable to meet even the most basic needs of the ever-expanding population. These changing conditions have given rise to revolutionary movements like the Maoist Shining Path, who are prepared to resort to methods far more drastic than the Indigenistas of the 30s would have considered. At the mock Inca Sun Festival of Inti Raymi, past meets present in an event which is much more than just a tourist spectacle. The modern Inca, an improbable creation revived only since the 1940s, is the vestige of the most romantic indigenista thought. He hands over a quipu, the Inca symbol of all knowledge, to the mayor, who as a Marxist advocates the recuperation of these Indian symbols as a way of raising consciousness. Politicians like him are the contemporary standard bearers in Cusco for the political meaning of the indigenous to the generation which Chambi and his friends envisaged.
Tenemos que partir diciendo de que la regeneración significa encontrar a la sociedad andina degenerada, en un estado de degeneración. Y esto yo no creo que sea cierto. Lo que ocurre es que coexisten sociedades que tienen hábitos, costumbres, historia, tradición diferentes. Hay una minoría dominante en el país, políticamente, cuestión de clases, que aplasta, silencia, que ha silenciado a ese indio histórico. Y conviven en medio de todo. Yo creo de que el gran mérito de los indigenistas es haber puesto a disposición principalmente de la intelectualidad y luego de la sociedad occidental toda, puesto en manifiesto la presencia, la existencia real de una sociedad que sigue resistiendo, que pese a un proceso cruel, genocida, que casi la extermina, sigue resistiendo y sigue creando.
For the European public, perhaps, these pictures are an extraordinary testimony about what a very Western instrument like a camera could provoke as aesthetic, as a reality recording in a marginal country. But for us, it's an extraordinary testimony of what we have lost and what we will still will lose in the future if we don't say stop and we will construct our nation obeying the orders, the demands of the past of our historical memoir.